All right. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to DAG in 2023, our first meeting of the new year. My name is Eli Storch. I'm the chair of the Design Advocacy Group, and it's exciting to see so many of you with us. As we're moving into a new year, I know a lot of you joined us for our first in-person meeting in a while in December with Carpenters Hall and ULI. We're going to be trying to do more in-person programming as well as virtual programming in 2023. So please, for the new year, check the invitation before assuming it's a Zoom, as hopefully we'll have some stuff in person that will get everybody back out into the world and out into the wild. One thing that we like to do at DAG is to introduce ourselves, and as we're here talking about architecture, why don't you introduce yourself in the chat and add your favorite building in Philadelphia with your name and why you've joined today, so that everyone can get to know each other a little bit. So as we go through this, if you have any technical difficulties, please try and message me, and I will do my best to help you out with any issues that you're having. Before we get into our program, we're going to have a few announcements and tell you about some of the upcoming work that DAG has going on. So let me throw first to George. George, do you want to give us a few advocacy updates to get started?
Yes, I'm very much looking forward to today's program. So I'm on a high note, but I have to start on a low note with, as many people are aware, we made two articles on University City townhomes and worked very hard to encourage the preservation of those housing units and for the people who are living in them now at the edge of the University City Science Center. The last I heard was that they were down to 15 residents out of 70 units. And in my opinion, that's not the critical mass that's going to result in a positive outcome. I'm still hopeful, but I don't think that that's likely to happen. There's a wonderful book out on the history of the Science Center. It does not dwell upon University City townhomes, but it raises the issue of science centers in general and expansion near the periphery of universities as an issue of both gentrification and bad urban renewal. Because as many people are aware, the original urban renewal for the University City Science Center resulted in the destruction of a significant African-American community called the Black Bottom, which continues, by the way, to hold reunions to this day. Another interesting note in terms of one of our other large city in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh announces a massive investment in affordable housing. And the investment appears to be something a little bit along the lines of rebuild here in Philadelphia. That is budget money used to support the interest and principal payments on bonds, and they're looking to significantly increase their support for affordable housing in Pittsburgh. The mayor of Philadelphia produced an end of the year report that called Equity and Opportunity for All. There it is. And it has four sections, four main sections: public safety, neighborhoods, education and youth investment, and growth and economic opportunity. They seem to be good goals. They claim that they have supported 2,000 affordable housing units. I'm not quite sure in what way that support existed, because 2,000 new construction units would represent about $500 million worth of construction investment. So that's but that report is out and available through the city of Philadelphia and the mayor's office. I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Eli.
Thanks, George. I appreciate that. Other advocacy items, Kat, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about Cobb's Creek?
Yeah, hey everybody. So with Cobb's Creek Foundation has proposed a zoning overlay sponsored by Curtis Jones. And the overlay basically would allow development at the site to ignore steep slope protections. And they want to erect 150-foot fences with no setbacks to protect the golf driving range there. And one of the main things that we're concerned about with this overlay is that it's removing the public feedback opportunity that would be included if they followed the regular zoning variance for this site. So there are a couple opportunities coming up to get involved with this. On Thursday is the next Planning Commission hearing at 1 p.m., which we invite everybody to testify. We're still in the middle of their review period. So I don't think that City Council will be voting on this, but they have a meeting scheduled for the 19th as well. And initially this bill was included for discussion in the City Council meeting. So I would encourage you to register to testify at the City Council meeting just in case it comes up. The deadline for that is today at 3 p.m. And also testify at Planning Commission and give your comments. Both these meetings will be on Zoom or virtual. If you have any questions about the details of the development, I'd be happy to chat with you about it. So reach out to me.
Thanks, Kat. We are also reviewing a bill relating to construction demolitions and how the demolition process works in light of some sad and inappropriate and high profile accidental demolitions that the city has suffered. So we are reviewing that bill and we'll be responding with some advocacy work around that as well. So keep your ears peeled for that. Another thing that is upcoming is DAG is working this summer to develop an urban design handbook. I'm going to drop it in the chat there. So that if you're interested in getting involved in that, we'll be working with some architecture and urban design summer interns, working with members of the DAG steering committee and putting something exciting together there. So there's some emails and folks to get involved with. So if you're interested in that, please reach out and get in touch with us, and we'll be putting together a team to go through that process and build something cool there. As I'm continuing to talk, if there's any other announcements, events, gallery openings, things that you would like to share, please throw them in the chat and we will do our best to hit them all and ask you to unmute and talk about them. But this is a forum for everybody. So David, I see your hand raised. Do you have something you want to share with us? You're muted.
Yeah, just a couple of things. One, a shameless plug for the conversation that I'll be having with two automobile buffs sponsored by the Beth Shalom Preservation Foundation about automobile design and Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture in the 1950s. It's Sunday 2 weeks away. Go to bethshalompreservation.org, bethshalompreservation.org. It's a free online discussion about big finned cars and Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture of the roadside. On a more serious preservation-related note, as most of you know, the consultative process, the public information gathering process for the Roundhouse is proceeding. And our program next month, right, Eli, is devoted to the Roundhouse, and that is an important discussion, I think, for us all to engage with. Inga Saffron's article in the Inquirer is a good introduction to some of the alternatives that may be available to us as we think about that site. And also important, and sort of quietly perking along, is that the RFP has gone out for the family court building, the old municipal court building, which has been put out for bid with the contingency that the developer must provide space for the African American Museum and office space for the library staff. A rather daunting assignment. which may make the conversion of the roundhouse look like an easy thing by comparison. So I think we're all waiting to see that. And finally, the citywide survey that was one of the major recommendations of the mayor's preservation task force that Mayor Kenny set up when he became mayor. The report of that process is proceeding, and I think that too needs to be, it certainly bears watchful examination as it goes ahead. That's it.
Thanks, David. I see Muldrow R is the name I see here. Do you want to unmute and tell us about the lecture you put in the chat?
Hi, I'm Ralph Muldrow, former Philadelphian, still follow the things there. So this is great. Thanks for having it. I'm going to give a talk on a Charleston architect who created the first historic district and designed good classical buildings. He studied with Cray at Penn and had a 60-year career in Charleston. So it goes into the Charleston Renaissance, which was a whole milieu of poets and etchers and artists and things in the 20s and 30s when Northerners came down and fell in love with the poor patented architecture, I should say. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Please, anything else if folks want to put in the chat, that's what it is there for. Another few items on the DAG agenda. We are wrapping up our fundraising campaign for the end of 2022. It'll run to the end of this month. So we rely on our folks on calls like this. So if you haven't yet and you're able, send a few bucks our way. We have been through Zoom able to save, record, and share to a broader audience. So if you head to our website, you can see our past presentations and take those in via the YouTube links that are linked in there. In terms of upcoming events, February 2nd, which is a Thursday, Isabella Segalovich is going to be giving a talk entitled "Making Reparations: How Can We Come Together to Preserve History and Ensure That Every Philadelphian Has a Home." So that will be our February program in a couple of weeks. And then in March, as David mentioned, we'll be having a conversation about the Roundhouse, which will do our best to cover as many topics as possible, and make sure that we're representing all sides of that discussion. We'll have some other programming in the spring, which will be focused on the regional trail network and the rail park, as well as some outdoor in-person activities going with both of those talks. So it's going to be a full end of winter into spring. Keep up with our website, and you'll see all of that good stuff. And now I believe Michael has joined us. Apologies that you had some technical difficulties getting in here. But I'm going to pass the microphone over to George to introduce our speaker today. If you have any questions along the way for our speaker, please put them in the chat. We'll do our best to get them all answered at the end of the conversation. So George, let me pass it over to you, and we can go from there.
Thank you, Eli, and welcome everybody, and welcome Michael Lewis and some of Michael Lewis's friends who are not ordinarily participants in DAG. We hope you will continue because you're now members. There's no admission charge. It's rare that you get to introduce in the academic lecture series. It's not that frequent that you get to introduce someone twice. And it's a great privilege for me that I introduced Michael when we invited him to Temple University about 15, 20 years ago. And it was a wonderful lecture. And we had a great party afterwards, something that we can't do in the age of COVID, but we hope to be able to start soon enough. And since then, Michael has been kind of busy. he has become, I would say, a public intellectual in the field of architecture, planning, and urban design, amplified by the great mouthpiece of the Wall Street Journal, which has a circulation of 2.8 million daily. 1 million of those are in print. It's a larger circulation than USA Today, which warms my heart. And of course, not all of those subscribers read Michael's column, but which is not in every day, I don't believe. Yet there's a tremendous platform there that is well deserved. Michael is the Faison Pearson Stoddard Professor of Art History at Williams College, and he has a BA from Haverford and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in art and history of architecture, where he studied with David Brownlee. He has an incredible ability to turn a phrase. In one review that he gave of the renovation of the circulating library of the New York Public Library System, this is across the street from the main branch. It's a renovation of what was once an Arnold Constable store. Arnold Constable was a famous department store. And he comments on what the architects did in their kind of modest but elegant work. And he says, what they wanted of all things was a library that functions like a department store. And I want to tell you just two very short anecdotes. Maybe there'll be three that are important. Oh, also, he's written 9 books. I think 8 are listed by the Department of Art History at Williams, and they haven't picked up the Philadelphia Builds yet on his list, and so that's where I'm getting the 9th. There may be more, and he has an incredible ability to turn a phrase, and he's also told me some stories that relate to that. He had just started with the Wall Street Journal in 2019, and he came out of class at Williams, and the phone rang, and they said, Notre Dame is on fire. We need 800 words in 2 hours. And the last phrase of that article is, but above all, it is the perfection of its form and the invincible authority of its presence that have made Notre Dame one of those few monuments that haunt our memory, a memory now seared by the image of Viollet-le-Duc's spire collapsing in the flames. And I think many of us saw that horrible moment either in real time or shortly thereafter. Another anecdote of a much more calm nature is that as a young researcher, he was working for a preservation firm that was renovating Founders Hall at Haverford, and Haverford did not know who the architect was of Founders Hall. Nobody seemed to know, and he was sure it was there somewhere because the university kept very good records, and he found it. The name is George Senoff, who was a carpenter turned architect who, after the experience of working for Haverford, returned primarily to carpentry. But Michael was able to demonstrate that Senoff was paid $2.97 less than the lithographer who made a picture of the building. And so it goes for those of us in the vineyard of architecture. And I think that the book, the great book, Frank Furness, Architecture and the Violent Mind, is still with us very much. And I'm reminded of the classic statement by William Faulkner that the past is never dead. It's not even past. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Michael Lewis.
George, thank you for that very excessively kind introduction. Can you hear me, George?
Yes, thank you.
I apologize to all. My computer died last week. The college gave me a new one, but then when I logged on this morning, the college didn't seem to know who I was. And it's as happens. I'm sorry. I should have anticipated that. George, you're very kind to mention that Wall Street Journal deadline where I had 2 hours to write 800 words about Notre Dame. I astonished my editor, and I never told him that I wrote my dissertation on the Gothic revival with David Brownlee, who I see there, and it was inside knowledge. I let him believe that I pulled a rabbit out of the hat. But let me bring up the talk and get it on PowerPoint for you. Slideshow. I can't see anyone, but I'm hoping you're still there. Are you there, George?
We're
You're still
seeing
there.
you.
Yes, I had muted myself. I'm here.
Oh, okay.
We're not seeing the talk, though. We're just seeing.
Oh, you are not seeing the, because I have not done screen share. Has somebody given me permission to share my screen?
You should, yes, you should have permissions.
Well, I'm looking for that particular window. Oh, it's right there. Perfect. Share. Okay.
There it is. Yes, now it's coming up.
Okay. Now go back to the. Yeah. All right. Let's perform a little mental experiment and pretend it's the year 1900 and you are looking for an architect. And let's suppose you've heard.
Mike, you're sharing your annotated version of the lecture.
That's what I don't want. How do I?
Do you have two screens?
It's
Just so you're sharing the second
Swap.
screen.
Swap.
Yeah, that's it.
All right, there we go.
That's
Looks
right.
great.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks.
So let's suppose you've heard good things about Frank Furness and you're going to Philadelphia to interview him. But long before you get there, you run into him because Furness worked for 3 of the 4 railroads on the Monopoly game board, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, and the Reading Railroad. And his work reaches from Pittsburgh to Wilmington up to New York. And if you came from New York, the first thing you would do would be to step on one of his ferry boats, here the Cincinnati, that wafts you across to Jersey City. And these are very innovative because they are driven by propellers rather than paddle wheels, which means that the entire lower cabin can be one continuous and open space. Here it is with brand new mahogany seats, mosaic tile floors, and evenly lighted by hundreds of incandescent bulbs. And you would walk directly from this ferry boat into your waiting train. And as you rocketed yourself to Philadelphia, you would be reminded of Furness every minute or so as you glanced out the window and saw one of his mileposts, like this one, just acquisitioned by the Whippany Railway Museum in New Jersey. If you're taking the Pennsy, you will arrive at Broad Street Station, a leviathan of a train station with the world's widest train shed behind and a 10-story skyscraper above, but which is so ingeniously laid out that when you walk into the waiting room, you have nothing overhead but a canopy of light and air. And you might glance over your shoulder if you had a minute into the massive relief sculpture of Carl Bitter's Spirit of Transportation, now reinstalled in 30th Street Station. And then you plunge into the streets of Philadelphia, where you will pass a great many bank buildings by Furness, instantly identifiable by their sense of nervous belligerence, until you come at last to his Provident Life and Trust building at 4th and Chestnut. Take an elevator to the top floor, the whole length of which is taken over by the office of Furness, Evans and Company. And at last you are ushered into the private office of the man himself, who turns and glares at you. And what a glare. Remember, this is a man who once told a friend that he had the best dream of his life. He overslept, went into the office before noon, and he found in his outer office all his former clients waiting impatiently. He brushed by them, went into his inner office, where I deliberately lighted a good cigar, put my feet upon a drawing board, and then leisurely admitted them one by one and insulted them all. This was his best dream. So begins your interview with Furness. But what would your conversation be like? What did Furness say? We would desperately love to know, because it would help us to understand what Furness was trying to say with buildings like this top-heavy, turret-tormented tower. What is this building saying? What are any of them saying? Furness doesn't tell us. He never wrote a single word of theory. In his lifetime, he only published one article, a curious primer on drawing flowers. And this has been the dilemma for all of us who have studied Furness, who is as silent about the meaning of his buildings as were the builders of Stonehenge. But that hasn't stopped us from weighing in, since public interest, ever since Furness has caught the public eye, beginning in the early 1950s. For example, James O'Gorman's brilliant essay, published exactly 50 years ago this year, related Furness to contemporary developments in architecture, seeing Furness as the synthesis, the Provident Life and Trust on the right, seeing Furness as Provident as a synthesis of the English picturesque and French structural rationalism. And there's our friend Viollet-le-Duc at top above William Butterfield. More recently, George Thomas has related to Furness to what he calls the engineering culture of Philadelphia, which was America's great manufacturing center after the Civil War. And there is something piston-like about the polished granite columns of the Provident, polished Aberdeen red granite from Scotland. But other scholars have looked more expansively, even metaphysically, at Furness as somebody grappling with the problems and demons of modernity itself. For example, Vincent Scully, who called the Provident, quote, a great machine out of technology's archaic beginnings, a cast iron marvel by Jules Verne, a great golem of industrialization clanking away. Lovely writing, to be sure, but it still doesn't tell us what Furness thought he was doing. Now, of course, you could evade the problem entirely and limit yourself to talking about his personal life, which is what I did when I wrote my Architecture and the Violent Mind in 2001, a title that let me talk about his experiences in the Civil War and how it shaped the rest of his life, particularly his posture, that bolt upright, ramrod erect, martial stride that everyone who knew him talked about. But since 2001, when that book came out, a whole new world of possibilities has opened up. And this is the digital world of digitized newspapers, magazines, books, which let us tease out scattered strands of interviews, most of them 1 or 2 sentence fragments that collectively give us, for the first time, a sense of Furness, not his inner life, but his outer life, how he spoke about his buildings to people. So I'm now working on another book about Frank Furness, in which I renounce a lot of what I say in that first book. And this book is to be called, tentatively, Frank Furness, 7 Ideas About Architecture, because I believe there are certain categories of architecture that challenged him at an artistic and intellectual level, and that he worked out solutions to these problems in an extended process of trial and error in succeeding buildings. One of those problems was motion. Furness was like the Italian futurists in recognizing that mechanical motion posed challenges unlike any architects had ever faced. That is, the physical fact of travel did not correspond with its psychological fact. A building was no longer a stationary piece of sculpture in space, but a lively blur, swiftly approaching or receding in space. How do you express that? But then there were simple practical matters. Transportation means constant stress, the friction of shuffling feet and baggage, the grinding of wheeled carts, the constant vibration and jolt of the trains themselves, or for that matter, the ferry boats and luxury ocean liners whose interiors are designed. So Furness addressed motion not only visually, but also physically, creating materials and systems that did not crumble under the constant shifts of tension and stress and shear in an ocean liner. Inventions such as his interlocking rubber floor tiles you see down here in the right. But an entirely different category of problems was the library, the house of words. And Furness designed a dozen important ones, large and small. Now here were two entirely different issues: how to store books rationally and how to make generous space for the reading of those books. And the central problem was that libraries constantly acquire new books. Problem he solved in the most daring way imaginable in the University of Pennsylvania Library in the upper left, where we all studied under David Brownlee. And he solved the problem of book storage in the most daring way by making a book stack here, whose outer wall could be extended on screws, marching southward on 34th Street as fast as the university could buy new property, which is very fast. And each new book could be stored at a cost that he calculated of 30 cents per volume. But another category of buildings we've already seen, Furness's aggressive banks, these marvels of insolence that seem to be trying just too hard, which reminds you of Alfred Adler, who coined the term compensation to describe the action you take to make up for real or perceived deficiency. In other words, the more you strut and swagger, the greater your insecurity. And by that standard, the bankers who hired Furness must have been quivering mounds of jelly. They had good reason to be. The 1870s was a kind of golden age of bank robbing, many great ones in Philadelphia. And then the panic of 1873 had just shown the country that any bank could collapse overnight. Anyway, those are three different ideas. I'm thinking of expressing them in one word title, using abundance to describe banks, better than wealth, maybe. But other ideas of Furness's were more general, such as color. Here is his debut building, major building in Philadelphia, Rodef Shalom, designed with George Hewitt. Here are his chromatic tiles. And best of all, his masterpiece of chromatic thought, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, with its dazzling shift from geological color on the outside, that is the color, as Ruskin said, of the materials of nature, to spectral color inside, that is the color of light as broken by a prism into primaries, blue, red, and gold, which he uses pretty much in the ratio recommended by Owen Jones, 8 parts blue to 5 parts red to 3 parts yellow. In other words, sky, the glow of the sun, and the orb of the sun itself. So there's color and there's fire, which not surprisingly was a special interest of Furness given his name. He grew up with the pun, which his family used shamelessly. Furness's father was Philadelphia's most important Unitarian minister. Whenever he would preach in New York, he would speak in the congregation of New York's most distinguished Unitarian minister, Reverend Bellows. And Reverend Furness could not pass up the opportunity to begin by saying, "Blow me up, Brother Bellows." Furness must have been tired of that pun, but his buildings in themselves are architectural puns, especially his fireplaces, chimneys, and ventilators. These massive stubby affairs here are not chimneys, but ventilators. A cast iron pipe heated them winter and summer by what else? A furnace to draw up the used up air and bring in fresh air from below. I can't give you the whole story in our limited time, given my lateness, but another idea of Furness that he dealt with his entire life was the expressive role of line, the exaggeratedly expressive line, alternatingly sinuous and angular, which he used to impart life to his flowers, but also to his caricatures, rather vicious characters. No friend or family was spared them. And these same exaggerated expressive lines worked their way in the end into his architecture, particularly abstract performances such as his tombs and memorials. Anyway, such are the categories I've been thinking about, which brings us to the last one, which really is going to be the first one, and that is the idea of character. What is the specific nature, the specific personality, the specific psychology and temperament of a building? In the absence of any written text by Furness to justify his buildings, they can be written off simply as weird. At the time of Furness's death in 1912, buildings like the Provident had become more or less incomprehensible. This is the age of the classical revival. And if your taste ran to classical temples carried out in decorous white marble, you would indeed be vexed by a building like this, which seems to lack all rhyme or reason. Now, you couldn't write it off as illiterate or incompetent. Furness's credentials were too good and his grasp of style too self-assured to do that. The only way they made sense was as a species of extreme personal eccentricity. And he was eccentric, we know that. He did indeed live his whole life as if the Civil War had never ended, on horseback as much as possible, and cursing, we know from every account, with great imagination and vigor, riding his horse at dawn every morning, starting at 6. Eccentric enough to build himself a facsimile of a Montana hunting lodge behind his house at 711 Locust Street, doubtless to the dismay of his wife. And she was probably even more dismayed at his habit on slow days in the office of firing his Civil War guns, to the immense pleasure of the illustrator, the Philadelphia Inquirer. So given this personality, it was easy for William Gray, the Philadelphia critic and teacher, who actually at this very moment was teaching Louis Kahn, another important Philadelphia prodigy. At this very moment, William Gray suggested that Furness's weird buildings were the work of a weird man, and that the Provident might easily have been considered an ogre's castle in a fairy tale. What a delightful phrase. And 50 years later, Robert Venturi echoed it, probably unconsciously, when he wrote his Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. But Venturi applied the metaphor to another Furness building, the National Bank of the Republic, with its bizarrely divided facade, that antagonistic turret in the middle and the entrance arch sliced cleanly in the middle as with a razor. For Venturi, this building was, quote, an almost insane short story of an ogre's castle on a city street. 2 ogres' castles. The repetition of the phrase is extraordinary. Both men were responding to the same thing, the elements of fantasy and brooding menace in Furness's banks, but with a crucial difference. Gray was using the term ogre's castle to condemn, Venturi to praise. Incidentally, I first pointed this out at a public talk at Drexel. It was the ARFA talk for the late Peter ARFA, rest in peace. Yeah, that was in 2008. And I had my text and I was unnerved when I looked out and I saw Robert Venturi sitting in the middle of the audience. Well, in for a penny, in for a pound. Now, a crucial change has taken place between 1917 and 1966. In 1917, an era of refined academic sensibility, Furness was deeply unfashionable. The crack about an ogre's castle was intended to dismiss him as a ruffian and an eccentric. In other words, he was the ogre, Furness. 50 years later, though, at a time when modernism had passed its heyday, become rather academic and even authoritarian, a ruffian eccentric who despised convention was the most attractive role model imaginable. And so Venturi's Furness was an anti-hero, of the same sort that was coming into fashion in the post-war era, the era of James Dean, Marlon Brando, or Jackson Pollock, all those surly, impulsive, hot-tempered, poorly socialized anti-heroes of the 1950s. And Furness fit neatly into their ranks. And so strange as it seems, both Gray and Venturi required an eccentric Furness. Gray to explain buildings otherwise inexplicable, Venturi to use a club to beat the capons and conformists of academic modernism. Well, that was the line I used in 2008, and I was relieved when I heard Robert Venturi's laughter booming out, and was charmed when he later asked for a copy of my text. I guess all was forgiven. So for Gray and Venturi, Furness's eccentricity was a historical necessity. But in each case, though, the effect was the same: to make his buildings into psychological productions rather than intellectual creations. And so instead of explaining Furness, they explained him away. But we don't need to do that anymore. We now, I think, for the first time, can put together Furness's own thoughts about architectural character. And it's partly due to a fabulous coincidence. Sometime in the mid-1870s, a dropout from medical school went to see Frank Furness about a job. This is a great photograph of Furness's office, northeast corner of 3rd and Chestnut, no longer there, although much of the rest of the street above it is, designed by Furness in 1870. And his office took up the entire top floor. In fact, we know that Louis Sullivan sat in this front drafting room. We know it from his own autobiography of an idea. I'm grateful to Aaron Wunsch, who discovered this in a stereo view at the library company. Particularly grateful because by zooming in on this window under the awning, we can actually see the name Furness and Hewitt, just barely masked by that early telephone pole. So George Heckel comes to see Furness, who had no job for him, but sent him to another architect who did, in the process earning Heckel's lifetime gratitude. And when Heckel later became a publisher of prominent trade journals, he always made sure to give Furness good press. And there's Heckel, and there he is editing the American Journal of Railway Appliances. What a great magazine title. And here's his article on Gravers Lane Station, which was designed by Furness in 1883, in which he gives a comprehensive account of the layout of the building, which surely comes from Furness's mouth itself. So vivid and lucid is it. The 4 principles are accessibility. You move straight from the tracks through the waiting room to the street, or vice versa. As clear as a simple exercise in 1st grade addition. Convenience, that the well-heeled residents of Chestnut Hill can enter under this porte cochere, because of course they're arriving by carriage. Also important is beauty of design. Furness makes a point of saying how all the diagonal lines converge at the tower. And finally, most important, the prominence of the office and waiting room as approached from the cars in front. In other words, he pushes out the tower and thrusts forward that great shed roof to hoist you out of your car and bring you up to street level. And it was pointed out a few years ago in a seminar I did on Furness. It was pointed out by Ben Allison that invariably Furness's buildings are photographed from the track side, while his contemporary H.H. Richardson always from the street side. In other words, Furness is designing for the man in motion, and Richardson is designing as a kind of serene and mighty portal that is a building that's static. But the most important sentence in the review is something Furness said, that you cannot, well, I think he said it for reasons you're going to see in a second. I think he said it, although Furness put it in the 3rd person. One cannot mistake Furness's stations for warehouses, chapels, manufactories, or cathedrals. What a bizarre turn of phrase. Who would ever mistake a train station for a cathedral or a chapel? The phrase stands out, but he used a similar phrase a few years earlier when he designed this bank on Chestnut Street, the Guarantee Trust and Safe Deposit, in one of the few color images we have of it. Sort of a strange double-barreled bank. It was actually two banks. The Guarantee Trust was in the back. In the front, originally, was the National Bank of the Republic. If you look at the plan on the right, the building has a wasp waist. It tapers so you can shut the door at night for the safe deposit building, and then it widens out again. Building had to be built in brick, and Furness must have been a bit apologetic about that, because when he described it, he said his goal in designing it was to make sure that this building in brick did not have the unattractive appearance of a market house or factory. Once again, he compares the building to things which he is not. This sentence turns out to be a regular part of his rhetoric. He used it throughout his career. I found it again and again in the newspaper. We don't have his design for the Academy of Natural Sciences. It's been lost. He lost the competition to James Windham, but we have, once again, the telltale sentence in his description. He wanted his building to prevent the observer from mistaking it for dwellings, stores, or a church. And actually, looking at Windham's building, I could imagine you mistaking it for a minute for a church in its serpentine green. So in other words, this is not just a verbal tick of Furness. I think it's a key to understanding his unwritten architectural theory. So if someone has a chronic habit, the first thing you want to do is to know where the habit began. And it began here in the first building he built of note in Philadelphia after the Civil War in 1867, the Mercantile Library. This was a subscription library begun in 1821 that had overgrown its Greek Revival temple on Fifth Street. The trustees of which were able to buy a defunct market house. This is the Franklin Market House, a short-lived one which made the mistake of opening 2 years before the Civil War. There it is under construction. What a spectacular interior view. Just one great hangar of an open space. There it is, looming large at its site at 10th and Sansom Street. And Furness's job was to take the shell of a building, clear out the wooden market stalls, and insert into it kind of a dental implant, a library. And here you see him step by step devising and refining his panopticon. That is, an all-seeing librarian from the center can observe all the desks as they radiate outwards. Extraordinary building. What a chance. The building is over 300 feet long, 80 feet wide. All he had to do was, like a hermit crab, invade this shell. But what did it look like? Well, he didn't want it to look like a market hall, so he devised a stately Second Empire frontispiece. There we see it at the front of the building. Unfortunately, they didn't have enough money to build that. So what was built was a much more modest elongation or elaboration. What Furness did was insert a mansard roof to either side of that semicircular arch. And I think he felt embarrassed by it. To dream so grandly, so bravely, and then to end up with really a glorified market hall, which might account for him saying that it has an air of substantiality. You would never expose it to be anything for a skating rink or a swimming bath. Notice he doesn't say you wouldn't mistake it for a market hall, because that's in fact exactly what it looks like. Now, how many times Furness must have heard that phrase? Well, you know, it doesn't look like a library. You can almost hear the defensiveness, the plaintiveness of this. And I can imagine Furness vowing that never again would he make a building that would look like something else. And there they are. There are the statements. There's 4 of the statements where he defines the building by saying what it is not, which means he's going to tell his client what he does to express what it is. Now, I notice at this moment, it is just 5 to 11. And because I began so late, I'm going to ask George if we have a hard ending at 11, in which case it's fine with me, we could go right to Q&A, or I could give some more thoughts, but what say you? And I know you people bargain for a 1-hour talk.
Oh, I would continue till you feel you've reached a conclusion. The questions are starting to build, but they just started. So I would continue till you feel you've reached the conclusion that you intended.
I've got the number of people are still signed in, George. I could wait till they start dropping off. No, all right. Let me continue then, but I'll do it. I will depart from my text to do it a little more breezily. So I've given you a pat explanation for what Furness is doing, to find the intrinsic nature of a building and to make it lucid by exaggerating those features which are peculiar to its building type. But the fact is, he didn't figure out how to do this overnight. If you look at his first buildings, you see him struggling and flailing. In fact, all of his early buildings are pretty much in the category of what we call juvenilia, pious imitations of the work of his teacher, which in this case is Richard Morris Hunt. His gatehouse for the Clarks in Germantown, which still stands, could easily have been designed by Richard Morris Hunt in Newport in the early 1860s. This row house just discovered at 42nd and Pine Street is a very conventional Second Empire. Furness figuring out what he can do. But it took him a while to figure out what he could do. In 1863, this building was built. This is the parade shed of the 1st City Troop Philadelphia Cavalry building, which has long since been demolished. It's simply a cavalry troop which needs a drill hall to perform its exercises. After the Civil War, so it was built at a time of high prices and expensive labor. After the Civil War, they completed the building by extending the front to give it a head house, that is, changing rooms, lockers, reception rooms. And naturally, Furness was the first architect they thought of. And in 1869, Furness made his design, which thank God wasn't built because it is a mess. Now, what he did was simply extend the logic of the building behind it forwards. The parade shed is 5 bays, so Furness brings out 5 bays, brings the central door right to the front. But you see Furness trying to ask himself, what is this building? Is it a stable? Well, down here, it looks like a stable. But up here with these oversized windows, it looks like a clubhouse. And up here, when we get to these dormer windows, it looks like actually a fashionable Philadelphia row house. So he's not sure if it's a residence, dormitory, clubhouse, or stable. In other words, he falls between 3 stools. It would have been built in green stone. That was the plan. And there's a curious flatness about it. Despite that tower, you can almost see Furness working out with great satisfaction the division into vertical and horizontal bays. It's an uninspiring design if you're going to try to raise money, and they couldn't raise enough money. They had to wait 4 years to build it. And when they built it, it was a completely transformed building with the exact same program. That is, stable entrance in the middle, big reception rooms above, and then smaller locker rooms in the top level. But look how the building is transformed by changing the bay division from 5 to 3. Now we don't have a mincing little small membered rhythm. We have massive pachyderm stride, a thumping assertion, something like a Crusader castle there on 20th Street. Transformation is stupendous. Most astonishing thing, Furness didn't change the plan at all. One thing he didn't get to build, though, was the corner turret. The building would have been more martial as he would have designed it. Here we've reconstructed on the basis of some surviving drawings what the building wanted to be. And here, of course, Furness is looking at the only book he bragged that he ever had any interest in, Viollet-le-Duc's Dictionnaire Rational, his Rational Dictionary of French Medieval Architecture. The building didn't need the tower. It was tough enough without it. So what has happened for Furness in these 4 years? This is not just improvement. This is not freshman to senior. This is transformation. This is caterpillar to butterfly. What happened? What happened is Furness spent those years designing and building the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts under the most intelligent client he ever had, Fairman Rogers, civil engineer, a youthful prodigy who became a professor of engineering at the University of Pennsylvania the year after he graduated. And Fairman Rogers shepherded the building's evolution from the original 1871 design to the building that opened in 1876. The original design was much fussier and crankier. Look at the transformation from the drawings of 1872 to the building that you know. All the brittle little passages of structural description at the top give way to an essay in pure color. Those are Owen Jones's colors. And year by year, you see the details getting more confident. 1872, the stair railing would have just been a writhing swirl of acanthus leaves. A year later, Furness is making the balusters grip the stair like the suction cups of an octopus's tentacles, until finally he hits on the idea of putting this universal joint-like cog there, transferring the diagonal thrust of the intermediate division to the vertical. But the biggest transformation of all is that the building bit by bit learned to express its iron construction. And this is because of an idea of Fairman Rogers that the building would not be built by a single contractor, that is, as Richardson did with the Norcross brothers, but that each element of the building, the foundation, the masonry above the foundation, the masonry walls, slate roof, iron timbers, ventilation, glazing, painting, plastering, everything would be done by a separate contract. In fact, Furness did this his entire career when he could. He said, you've got a better building for it and a cheaper building. I'm showing you the contracts that went into the building of the Furness Library at the University of Pennsylvania. Everything spelled out as a separate, discrete building operation. The steam heat, the millwork, the granolithic pavement. The result is a building which looks as if it's assembled from discrete operations by different teams who click and bolt and clank their parts into space. And here you can now divide them, having seen that. The bricklayer, the terracotta, the ironwork, all bolted in place. Something we know from his train stations, but shows up even in his domestic architecture. All of this, these are the lessons of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. And how did he apply those lessons in the rest of his career? Let me just give you 3 examples. What is the essence of a train station? This is the first one that he designed, complete station. It was not built in Shamokin, 1876. I don't think Furness could have claimed this is a train station that would not be mistaken for a church or a club. It doesn't quite express the nature, to me, of transportation and motion. What does that require? It requires some sort of announcement of the presence of the station to a person approaching from a distance, as he did beautifully at Mount Airy Station. And my classmate Preston Thayer is the one who realized that here for the Reading, Furness is probably punning on the great coal breakers and loading devices that loaded anthracite coal into the coal cars of the Reading. And here is something that can be seen by the passengers on the train as they approach. What's the nature of a hotel? What is the nature of a hotel? This I feel very fondly about. This is in Bryn Mawr, the Bryn Mawr Hotel, now the Baldwin School. When I went to Haverford starting in 1975, I walked by it every day. I didn't know it was Furness, but I couldn't take my eyes off of it. Furness was given the job in 1890 to replace a hotel that had burned, and there it is above. Now, that's by the Wilson brothers, and that is not a hotel that you would say could not be mistaken for anything else. You could easily mistake that, I don't know, as a Quaker reform school, perhaps an asylum, hospital, perhaps, but there is nothing about it that speaks of leisure and comfort in the countryside, which was Furness's goal. And for Furness, the things that expressed that were the spreading, swelling veranda and the roof, which gives you cozy shelter, which is why I suspect Furness drew the building from above. That is, I describe this, this drawing as one that celebrates the great upward tapered swing of that central tower, which I once described as a cone of sociability. And I'll leave you with one last building, and then we can go to the questions. 1876, Furness had, I think, one of the most challenging problems of his life: how to design a display pavilion at a World's Fair. And this is the task he was given by the country of Brazil to design the Brazil building that represented now the Empire of Brazil. Well, almost every other pavilion at the Philadelphia Centennial exhibit treated a display case, just treated the task of a display pavilion as either making a very large display case or a very small building. And neither of them quite strike the festive note. A World's Fair is a temporary thing. It arrives in a blaze of spectacle, a splash of color and exuberance and excitement, and then is swept away at the end of the fair. In a sense, it's nothing more than one great big temporary tent. So Furness's building is a kind of exclamation of colored festivity in the colors of Brazil, in his colored tile, but somehow exulting in its temporary nature. Well, let me leave you with this thought. If you were to go into Furness's office and say, what do your buildings do? He would say they solve their problems cheaply, quickly, but above all, I will dig into the essence of your problem and make it sing out so that it will never be mistaken for anything else but what it is. And I would find that in the unique properties of what it does. That's what I have to offer. And if you don't like it, to hell with you. Although I think Furness might have said it more pungently. So that's the talk. So let's go to the questions. And once again, I'm sorry for being late.
I want to start with a question that summarizes another part of Philadelphia Builds. One of the things you're quoted as saying in the interview at Haverford was that Philadelphia building was so interesting because in some cases it took so long and people fought so much about what to build that the buildings were built long after the style in which they were conceived had become obsolete or no longer worth the rest of the world thinking about. And how does that marry with Furness's life experience? And I'm also thinking of, again, the somewhat sad and final years when he worked on the McKim, and White Girard Bank building, but they couldn't tell the client that he was working on it because they didn't want him.
George, that's the biggest question of all. Philadelphia, we have a way of building great monuments at the exact moment the style goes out of date, like Girard College opens 1847 when the style is as dead as a doornail, or Philadelphia City Hall, which is almost comically out of date by 1901 when it's pretty much finished. I think behind all this is the phenomenon of Philadelphia's charming indifference to fashion. It's our Quaker legacy. Quakers are not meant to be fashionable. To be fashionable is worldly. I don't know of the 90s, well, now we're down to 86 people out there. I see one Quaker there. I see Mariana Thomas, and there may be a couple more. Philadelphia is honorifically now a Quaker city, but the style of Philadelphia is not to fret so much. We still frown on strutting, swaggering fashion plates in this city. Go to an art, just prove it. Go to an art opening in Philadelphia and go to one in Manhattan, and you will see the difference. And that applies to architecture. But because Quakers are indifferent to fashion, they also have a freedom of they don't have the burden of trying to fit the spirit of the time, which is why occasionally they do something extraordinarily modern. Furness Library is extraordinarily modern, but so is the PSFS building, a bank created by a Quaker board, which did that very Quaker thing. They looked at pragmatically at the problem and they solved it with an utter indifference to how fashionable it was. It turned out it was fashionable, but that was a byproduct of pragmatic decisions. So George, you asked the question, what is the nature of Philadelphia? And that conversation is endless.
I have a more specific question that one of our members has asked. What style does Furness fit into? He doesn't fit neatly into the Victorian era, but he is of it.
Yeah. At different times he builds in the Gothic, the Romanesque, late in life, the colonial. When clients pressed him, and I think reporters did, he often fudged by said it's in the composite style. That word shows up a lot, which was his way of saying the eclectic synthesis.
Wonderful.
But style was not his. I think he began thinking in terms of style. I'm building a synagogue, it should be Moorish. I'm building a bank, it should be a temple. But later, style became incidental to the way he thought of things: the roofs, doors, walls, dormers, chimneys.
Then we have another question. Roughly how many buildings remain in this area, Philadelphia and its surroundings? And also, did he work much outside of Philadelphia?
Good question. George Thomas has been trying to keep a tally of it. There's a good 150, maybe up to 200. We don't know how many buildings he designed, particularly his domestic architecture. A couple row houses. There may have been more. So when you say how many, do you count the row houses one design or 8 or 10? In our complete works, we documented upwards of 700. Some, maybe we're up to 1,000 now, but typically his practice was Eastern Pennsylvania, extending into New Jersey, a smattering of things in New York. He tried very hard to get into Minnesota for James Hill, the railroad baron there, and didn't crack that nut, and horrified Hill when he sent him a bill for almost $10,000 for his preliminary designs. But he's a Pennsylvania architect, and I think that's one of the reasons he's so hard to unravel, because his clients spoke to him in conversation, did not leave much of a paper trail as there would if he'd had a national practice like Richardson.
Now, here's an interesting question. A Penn student or faculty member comments on being in the Furness Library on a spring night and experiencing a delightful breeze blowing through, and was wondering whether that was caused by Furness's ventilation scheme or just the wind blowing through the windows near the top. I'm not sure we could answer that with the evidence given, but it's a wonderful question.
Yeah, I don't know. Furness's buildings, like every one of his era, were air conditioned passively. There is no active air conditioning. Begins in the 1890s, but Furness's buildings are beautifully airy and well ventilated. I'm not sure when that wind came wafting through the window, though. It must have been before 1986 when the building was renovated by Venturi Scott Brown.
Now here I have a challenge in the Digby Balsall tradition. One of our correspondents has stated, but Boston is even more indifferent to fashion. Do you care to comment on that statement?
Well, yeah, maybe true. I think in the coefficient of frumpiness, I think we have Boston beat. I would say, but the cardinal difference, and this is not my idea. This comes from the spectacular book by David Hackett Fisher, Albion Seed. The difference between Philadelphia culture and Boston culture is Puritans have ministers and have a university to train them and have Harvard. Quakers don't have ministers, and education in Philadelphia was always practical, as it is to this day. We're still the great center of medical education. So there are differences within differences.
Now, we're a little low on the questions at the moment. I hope that there'll be another burst.
No, that's all right. I've kept people here too long, George, I think. I think some people
every time David adjusts his monitor, I think he's raising his hand to ask a question.
David has heard all these sentences before. He's already.
Well, and beautiful sentences they are. I think, well, shall we ask for one more round? If anyone wants to ask a question, could they please put it up quickly? And by the way, I winged it in saying that you should continue when you asked whether we should halt a few moments ago. The overwhelming response in the chat line was don't stop, just keep going. So there was mass support for that.
Oh, thanks.
I would say while we wrap up, there's a question about how many Furness buildings are listed on the city register.
Oh, I don't know the name of it. I don't know the answer to that. But there are probably
You can look into that.
People who are watching who could answer that. Certainly a dozen. There's First Unitarian Church, Academy of Fine Arts. But the thing is, the city register is erratic, and there's important buildings that have not made their way onto the city register or the national one that should. I don't, yeah. I'm
A couple of good questions have come up, two very different ones. Was there an influence of Frank Furness in the South? And are there any Furness buildings in danger of demolition?
One was torn down last week, 2202 Walnut Street. I mean, the facade had been altered, 22, or maybe it's 2204. There's a big hole in the south side of Walnut. Question about the South. No, but there are not so much the South, but in the Midwest and the Far West, there are copies of Furness banks. Both the Provident and National Bank of the Republic were copied almost line for line all the way out to Salem. A general influence of Furness you see more in Chicago, partly because Lewis Sullivan trained in his office, and Chicagoans, when they came east, did come to Philadelphia. But the South, I think, not so much.
And I think we have two questions that I'm going to conjoin that might be the very fitting way to close. One, the first of those is, how do you reconcile your view of Furness from The Violent Mind and Now, which you've alluded to? And the second one is, do you think Furness is the most exciting architect to work in Philadelphia?
Wow. How do I reconcile The Violent Mind? He indeed had a violent mind. And since the book came out, I've found many more strands that confirm it. Of course, the paper trail is almost completely eliminated. I was in touch with the granddaughter of Furness's partner, Alan Evans, who told me a very sad story that as Furness became more erratic, They had worked out a plan, this is after 1900, to bring in one of the Evans family to take over the management of the firm and let Furness just discreetly recede into the background. So there, I believe now that he was what we would call not borderline, bipolar, manic depressive. But you don't need that. You don't need that to explain the buildings. There's a lot of people who are bipolar who are not great architects, and there's a lot of great architects who aren't bipolar. But it's a good question. And the other part of that question was, George, besides the violent mind, was the
did you think he's the most exciting architect to work in Philadelphia?
Let's say he's not the most important. That would be Louis Kahn. Let me say he's not the most exquisitely beautiful. That would be Wilson Eyre. He's not culturally the most significant. That's probably Benjamin Latrobe, who brought architectural professionalism to America. I think he is the most interesting. Now, how do I put it? He's like Edgar Allan Poe. He's like Walt Whitman. He is a major American creative force whose meaning goes beyond architecture. And he's not the level of Michelangelo, granted, but like Michelangelo, he's an architect who will speak to every generation that succeeds us. He will have some new things to say.
And we have two more questions that just came in, or one question, one comment that are very, very interesting. The question is, which of Furness buildings kind of gains the most or from the Gothic style, which leads to a lot of comments about the interaction with Gothic. And the comment is from someone who worked at the Fisher Fine Arts Library and reports that in spite of Furness's desire for the buildings to be seen as they are and not as something else, reports that over the last 30 years, many of the visitors to the library often ask me if it was originally a train station.
Well, it turns out it was. And thanks to David Brownlee, I published an article about that. The model was train station, which it was in the Journal Society of Architectural Historians during David's editorship. And we just discovered this, that at the meeting of the American Library Association around 1880, it was proposed that the train station was the ideal model for a library because it had a head house where you read, the head and the shed could keep moving where the train went. So so there is a train station there. Why the Gothic? The Gothic, not because he was particularly pious. I don't believe he was at all. I think religious terms only came out of him when cursing. I think the Gothic was the style of freedom, which he appreciates because it let him play with sculptural form. He was trained by Richard Morris not to make classical buildings, but the Gothic was a permission slip to play with asymmetry, top heaviness, and all sorts of forces that aren't congenial to the serene display of weight and force in a classical wall.
I think I'm going to turn it back to Eli at this point with a great thanks to you, Michael, and to our very loyal and creative audience. And I think I might say that we owe you a party also in the future when we are not constrained by COVID so much.
I accept. I'll be on time.
Thank you very much. If anyone wants to turn their video on, we offer our virtual round of applause here. Thank you so much, Michael. That was really wonderful. There were a few folks who asked. We will be putting the video up on our website. So that will be, if you go to our events page, you will see that probably later today or tomorrow. We'll get that video up if anyone wants to share this far and wide. Other than that, we will see you on February 2nd with Isa Sigalovich, who's going to be doing our next presentation. And then in March, we'll be talking about the Roundhouse. So thank you everyone for joining. thank you, Michael, again for a wonderful presentation,
My
and
pleasure.
have a great Wednesday. We're usually on Thursday. A great Wednesday.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.